Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 6 of my Witchwood card review, and I just so happen to have 6 new cards to look at, including some that interact really interestingly with hero powers. Gan and Baku might have a shot after all, Baku in particular with these cards. So if you don't have a lot of time, you just want to see the cards, you can use the link in the description, skip to the end. If you got a little while and you want to hear me discuss these cards in greater detail, then let's go ahead and jump into my detailed reviews. Up first here I have the Clockwork Automaton, a new 5-mana 4/4 mech. And he looks like he's made out of wood, which is pretty cool. Looks a bit like Pinocchio even. And he has an effect here that reads double the damage and healing of your hero power. Yikes, we got hero power synergy cards once again. This is almost like the Grand Tournament and Inspire is coming back to life in some ways because we have cards that benefit your hero power. And that's a pretty crazy benefit too, let's be frank, right? So even just starting with something like the Mage hero power, for instance, making it a 2 damage ping is fine. Not something you typically want to combo with a 5-mana card. But as you look at other hero powers that do direct damage, and by the way, this will not work on things like Druid, presumably, because it's not direct damage that's giving the damage to your hero, so I doubt this would double the damage that your hero receives. This is going to work on targeted hero powers or raw damage hero powers where the hero power itself does the damage. With Druid, remember, your hero power is giving your hero damage. It's not doing the damage. So Hunter, Mage, a lot of the Death Knight hero powers like Shadow Reaper, Anduin, and Gul'dan, etc. Some of the Quest hero powers like Quest Warrior in particular is what I want to talk about. So once you lock in that quest and you get Sulfuros and you get the Ragnaros hero power, this will double it. So it would do 16 damage while the Clockwork Automaton is on board. And that's pretty bonkers, right? And you'll note that this is also an odd cost card, which means you could run this with Baku the Moon Eater in an odd cost deck, and that includes a ton of upgraded hero powers. So guess what? Mage already gets to double the hero power from Baku, then they get to double it again with Clockwork Automaton. So clearly this is the kind of card that could support Baku fairly well. Now, all that said, talking about the potential is great. There's a lot of opportunity here to do some crazy things. But is that going to be worth it when you start to look at the cost and the stat and the opportunity cost, essentially, of a card like our Clockwork buddy here? And that's where I'm starting to worry a little bit. Because, first off, 5 mana is a fairly big commitment. You just don't have that much mana left to do other things. Yes, you can weave in a hero power with 5 mana, but only once you get towards the later portions of the game. And at that point of the game, hero powers tend to have a little bit less value on average just because they're hitting bigger things, they're affecting bigger things. Now, for classes like Priest, where you're talking about the healing of Clockwork Automaton, that might be less relevant of a concern because 4 healing is still pretty good in the late game. It can buy you time, it can help you stabilize in a control deck. There are other ways to buff your healing. Imagine if you had Velen on board, there'd be so much hero power doubling, essentially, and that'd be pretty crazy. On top of that, there are some Death Knights that could particularly benefit from this. Think Blood Reaver Gul'dan. The interaction there is really crazy because it doubles the damage aspect of Blood Reaver Gul'dan, which means it would do 6 damage instead of 3, and it also doubles the lifesteal aspect of Gul'dan. So it would do 6 damage, and then it would heal you for 12, which is an enormously powerful 2-mana play. Now, even in that scenario, though, where you've got Gul'dan out and you play your Clockwork Automaton, usually if you've gotten a Gul'dan out, you're winning the game 90% of the time anyway. So in some ways, Clockwork Automaton feels a bit like a win more card in that regard. Like the times that this is most powerful and most influential are already times that are in the late game, later mana stages where you've begun to stabilize or made some kind of powerful play that makes your hero power good in the first place. So I don't think it's good there. Maybe in Baku decks it makes a little bit more sense here and there, but there are only some classes that directly benefit from this. So essentially a lot of limitations, a lot of caps on the potential for the Clockwork Automaton as far as I'm concerned. So up next, let's talk about the Blackwald Pixie. This is yet another hero power synergy card. A neutral minion. She's a 3-mana 3/4, and her battle cry reads, refresh your hero power. So whereas Clockwork Automaton is more about, I think, kind of the upside or the crazy high roll opportunities that exist, I think Blackwald Pixie is more about consistency, because basically this effect is always going to do something pretty good. Across classes, across hero power types, she can be squeezed into a lot more decks and make it fit. And frankly, I think she can be squeezed into a lot more turns to make her fit as well. Because first off, her stat line is much, much better for the cost than the previous card. A 3-mana 3/4, still a great stat line. Not something we see on all that many 3-drops these days. And good to play into the early board, trade into small stuff. If you're desperate, you can just play her as a spider tank, essentially. But then as you get into the mid to late game, if you have an upgraded hero power or something like Baku in particular, because clearly this is yet another odd card for a deck like a Baku deck, and you have that upgraded hero power and you can hit it once and get maybe, say, a couple Silver Hand recruits, and then you hit it again, and hey, guess what? More Silver Hand recruits. Suddenly you turn what was a fairly empty turn, if you didn't have a ton of cards or flexibility, or maybe you just had a bunch of high-cost stuff you couldn't squeeze together, you get a way to build a nice little board thanks to only Blackwald Pixie. So clearly better the better your hero power is, much like the Automaton, but I think a little easier to squeeze into turns and still get value out of because of her reduced cost and more efficient stat line. Now, kind of on the other side of that coin, though, is that even though you can fill turns with her, to get value out of Blackwald Pixie, you do kind of have to have a lot of spare mana laying around. So there might be other instances where it's hard to fit her in, and suddenly you feel like you have a 3/4 that's stranded in your hand a bit because you don't really want to commit 4 mana to getting a refreshed hero power. So in some ways, despite the consistency of the effect, it's also a bit restrictive on your mana too. So there is potential to help her save the day, but she could also be stuck and be hard to work with. So I see some downsides there. I think the stat line makes up for that because it might just feel okay to play her sometimes minus that battle cry, and that makes her a little bit more reliable in your deck list and in a faster meta, which is really, really important, unlike the previous card, which would just be way too slow to play in a fast meta for its stats. So I think I like Blackwald Pixie a little better. It does a lot of the same kind of thing. She works in more decks. I do think there could be a Baku deck that finds a home for Blackwald Pixie. I don't know that a normal Hearthstone deck that doesn't have some sort of hero power focus is gonna find a reason to run her despite her spider tank stats. It seems like she might just fall a little short compared to so many of the other strong, high synergy plays you can pull off in Hearthstone these days. But nonetheless, a card with some promise, looks good, passes the vanilla test essentially, and has some upside in the right kind of environment. So now I want to move on to another neutral card. This is the Scaleworm, a new 4-mana 4/4 beast. And its battle cry reads, if you're holding a dragon, gain +1 attack and rush. So this is a, believe it or not, dragon synergy card, which is interesting. And at best, assuming you have a dragon in hand, this guy becomes a 5/4 minion that can attack other minions instantly the turn that it's played. That's what rush means, in case you needed a reminder. And that means it's essentially a Yeti stat line just swapped around. A 5/4 is sort of the vanilla stat line for a 4-drop. But rush is clearly an upside over a normal vanilla 4-drop minion. So better than average, you could say. That said, I'm not absolutely in love with Scaleworm. I don't think Rush is good enough necessarily to make this card relevant in most really powerful, strong meta decks. Now, the ideal use case is your opponent plays a Tar Creeper on turn 3, and you Scaleworm on 4, and you kill their Tar Creeper, and you're left behind with a minion. It is admittedly a susceptible minion in those instances because, it gets damaged after it trades immediately, but you did kill something and you got some stats behind, so ideally a 2-for-1 situation. Now, I think that's the ideal scenario. I think there are a lot of other scenarios where you have to trade it into something in which it dies immediately, so just killing those Cobalt Scalebanes across from you, for instance, and then it feels way worse. Like, yes, you killed a Cobalt Scalebane for your 4-drop, but the Scalebane probably already got some value or whatever other 5/5 they played. And a 1-for-1 trade doesn't feel nearly as good, particularly when you're on the back foot and you're playing defensively. On top of that, you have to run this in a dragon deck, which is a somewhat difficult condition to meet. So other times this could just be a stranded 4/4 in your hand that doesn't get to do anything at all the turn it's played. So very poor play in that scenario. And of course, that means you can only run it in dragon decks too, so it's quite restricted in its accessibility across multiple classes and archetypes. Not everybody's going to be able to put together a reasonable dragon deck. So some real challenges for Scaleworm to overcome here, and frankly, I think even in the best case scenario, it's still just sort of a merely playable card. So thanks to all those restrictions, or due to all those restrictions, I should say, and the fact that the upside just isn't that high, I don't really think this one's going to make the cut. It's fine. It'll be a solid arena card. There's nothing wrong with it inherently. Just not a card I expect to be quite good enough in constructed play. So now let's talk about some class cards. Up first here I have a new mage minion called the Vex Kuro. It is a 4-mana 3/3, yet another beast. This seems to be the trend with Witchwood so far. And its effect reads, whenever you cast a spell, summon a random 2-cost minion. So that's pretty cool. There's a ton of upside there. You can do a lot. You can build an entire board of 2-drops with Vex Kuro, and that's a good play. Now that's in a vacuum. We do need to think about the kinds of decks that would run Vex Kuro and perhaps compare it to some other similar cards we've seen in the past. I think the most immediate comparison that comes to mind for me is Violet Teacher, a card in the classic set, a neutral minion that has been played pretty successfully and constructed quite a bit. It's also a 4-drop. It also summons you a minion on a spell cast. Now there are a couple distinctions. Violet Teacher is a 3/5, so a much more survivable stat line, I would argue, than something like Vex Kuro. Alternatively, Vex Kuro summons 2-cost minions, which are on average much, much better than the 1/1s that Violet Teacher summons. So a bit of a trade-off there. And it really just depends on what you're trying to do, whether that could be worth it or not. So for instance, with Violet Teacher, sometimes you can play it out on the board and it will linger for a turn and you could get really good value. Opponents usually recognize that it's a high priority target, so it doesn't always live. But at 5 health, has a much higher likelihood to survive through a turn than something like Vex Kuro. But the upside for Violet Teacher is a lot smaller too, because the 1/1s aren't as aggressive or threatening as 2/2s, or 2-mana minions, which are sometimes pretty good. You could get a board full of Knife Jugglers and go absolutely ham. You could also get a Doomsayer and backfire from time to time. That's a little bit of a risk. The unpredictability of Vex Kuro is a slight issue, but a small issue, I think, very, very small. So essentially, what that means for Vex Kuro, I think, is that it has to be able to go off in a single turn more often. It needs to be able to play 2 or 3 spells immediately the turn it's played to make sure that it gets its value. Because obviously you can't play it preemptively and just let it die. That's a terrible 4-mana play. That's just awful. 3 health is not enough for a 4-mana card. So essentially, I think that means you need a couple mana points or some sort of setup with it to make it good, which I think makes it essentially a 5, 6, 7 mana kind of play, not necessarily something you can do reliably on turn 4. Yes, there are shenanigans with things like coin. If you're on the coin, you can do, arcane missiles or mirror image to get some really, really quick value out of Vex Kuro. You can also combo with Sorcerer's Apprentice for reductions, but that adds to the cost total or the preemptive setup nature as well. So essentially what I'm getting at here, I'm taking a long time to get to this point, but I think it's not quite as good of a mid to late game, or I should say mid-range card, as Violet Teacher, and I don't think it's quite as good of an early game card as something like Flame Waker, which used to be the centerpiece for Tempo Mage, and I think Vex Kuro could theoretically be the centerpiece for a new style of Tempo Mage that moves away from the secret package and more towards a Vex Kuro package. I think, I'm going to use this word again, it's going to trigger some people, I'm sure. I think this card's a little bit of a tweener. It falls in between aggro and really even mid-range, and certainly falls in between control. I don't think summoning 2-drops is good enough for a card like Vex Kuro, not to mention control mages would want to run more expensive spells that would be harder to combo with Vex Kuro. So it really has to live in that mid-range or aggro scenario. And I'm worried that it's just going to be hard to piece everything together to make it make sense. So if you slam this on turn 6, if you play 1 Frostbolt with it, is that worth it? Is an extra 2-mana minion worth it compared to a 3/3? It's not bad, certainly. You'd get essentially probably 5/5 in stats for 6 mana, or really for 4 mana, because you spent 4 mana on your Vex Kuro. So a 4-mana 5/5, hey, that's not too bad. As you get to a second or third spell, you can see the real value in Vex Kuro. But by the time you get to turn 6, 7, where those scenarios are happening, it's much more likely your opponent now has a Spreading Plague, has acquired a Hellfire or now a Lord Godfrey, for instance, or just has hit their Psychic Scream or removal, whatever it might be, or that you just took too long in the first place and now you're dead. So it's going to be hard, I think, to swing a game with Vex Kuro in those later turns. When you compare Vex Kuro to something like Call to Arms, for instance, right now that's really popular at the 4-mana slot, that's an instant infusion of stats for one single card. Vex Kuro, on the other hand, to get the same kind of stat dump that Call to Arms gets, is going to have to utilize at least 2 other spells. They'd have to be 0-cost spells to get it all out for 4 mana, and even then, it's not quite as predictable or high synergy as the minions you're getting from Call to Arms, which you know are minions you want to run. They have like Divine Shields, or they're Knife Jugglers, or they're really good. Vex Kuro gives you some random stuff that may or may not be awesome. So to me, it doesn't look nearly as aggressive as Flame Waker, a card which was really good at swinging the board and sometimes really good at doing damage to your opponent's face, most of which Mage needed in the early game. Vex Kuro's not going to swing nearly as hard because it doesn't address your opponent's side. I don't think it works quite as well as a mid-range minion compared to Violet Teacher, nor do I think Mage can support Violet Teacher quite like a deck like Druid has done so successfully, because Mage doesn't have cheap spell board buffs like Druid does. Certainly doesn't seem to fit in a control deck. So I've taken forever essentially here to say that I think Vex Kuro in a vacuum looks fine. It does something very good for its cost. Summoning free 2/2s is awesome. But when you look at it from an actual game context standpoint, like how is this going to work? What kind of deck's going to make it work? I have a lot harder time seeing it in action. I don't see how it's going to fit. So that's my challenge. I think fundamentally a card with some strengths, but I think also a card that will probably not find a deck, at least right away. So I think Vex Kuro's maybe more of a scarecrow. Like from far away, it looks like a dude standing in a field, but as you get up closer, you realize it's kind of just filled with straw. So up next here, let's talk about Wanted, a new rogue spell at 4 mana. It reads, deal 3 damage to a minion. If that kills it, add a coin to your hand. So this one is a really puzzling spell. The first comparison, I guess, that comes to mind for this card, and I guess that's because it's the most recent, is probably Flanking Strike for Hunter. In that scenario, you get to do 3 damage to a minion, and regardless whether or not it kills it, Flanking Strike still summons you a 3/3 wolf, and that's a really nice mid-game tempo swing. Like, you get to kill something and summon something. That's the dream in Hearthstone. Initiative is yours once again. And that's perfect for Hunter because it summons a beast. Like, it's really high synergy with the class. But when you look at Wanted here for Rogue, you only get a coin instead of a 3/3. And only if it kills the minion. And that condition, killing a minion, is honestly kind of frustrating because sometimes you just can't play Wanted. For instance, if your opponent has a 4 health minion and you have 4 mana, there is just nothing that you can do. There's no reason to cast the spell. You would then be spending 4 mana for essentially a Dark Bomb, which would be miserable. At least with Hunter, like, if they have a 4/4 out there, you can still hit it with Flanking Strike and summon a 3/3 to set up a trade or get an additional asset on the board. With Wanted, you don't get anything else. You don't even get the coin unless the minion dies. So it has to line up pretty well to work, condition to be met. And then when you get the coin, essentially, what have you gained? You've gained 1 mana back on a future turn. So that sort of kind of reduces the cost of Wanted to 3 mana in total tempo if you consider it stretched out across the entire game. But of course, you can't actually use it on turn 3, which is a big deal because as you get to turn 4 and 5 and 6 and so on, 3 health things or things with 3 health remaining are rarer and rarer sights. So I think it gets harder to use throughout the course of the game. It's a pretty expensive spell for Rogue, particularly in a Miracle Rogue environment where you're looking for cheap spells to use with your Gadgetzan Auctioneer. And the only the only deck I can really think of that would want to use this card is a Miracle Rogue because it gives you a coin. The only reason you'd want to play this card is to get the coin. And coins can be great in Rogue, of course. That's a good upside. It's probably still not as good as a 3/3 wolf, but it has value in Rogue. Rogue can set up combos more easily. You can just use it as an innervate to cheat out something a little sooner. You can combo with your Auctioneer to draw a card. You can make your Edwin bigger. There's a lot of utility for a coin, and Counterfeit Coin is rotating out. But that said, like, if you have an Auctioneer on board and Wanted is your only spell in hand and you're looking to go off, like, you can't really go off because you only have 7 or 8 mana. You just can't cast it. And if you draw it after you've already started going off on Auctioneer, guess what? It's going to sit in your hand for a while. You might have to hit your own Auctioneer with Wanted, and then it doesn't die and you don't get the coin. Like, there's a lot of use problems here with Wanted in combination with Auctioneer. Yes, there's a preparation in Rogue, and yes, you could prep a Wanted to make it cheaper, but you could also prep a Fan of Knives or some other card that does something awesome too. So there's a great opportunity cost with prep. Prep is not the answer to this card's downfalls. So because of that conditionality, because it doesn't provide any sort of really big swing on the board, the value is passive and delayed because it takes you a while to make that coin useful most of the time. Because it doesn't synergize with a single deck that I can think of that wants to use the coin, to me it feels like Wanted has some major issues and some major problems. When I first reacted to this card, I didn't realize it had to kill the minion. Thought maybe it was a little more consistent, but it sure seems to fall short now. A lot of people are comparing it to Tomb Pillager, and the reason, you ran Tomb Pillager sometimes was to get the coin, but this is 1,000 times worse than Tomb Pillager, because Tomb Pillager was a 5/4 minion that applied a ton of pressure. Again, something Miracle Rogue likes to do. They need to hit the face. They have to win the game eventually. Tomb Pillager was fantastic in that set. And Wanted just will not do the same thing at all. It's not 5 damage, it's not 4 health. It's a 3 damage targeted spell that's hard to work in the deck. So to me, Wanted is actually terrible. I just don't see how this one's going to work. It doesn't make any sense to me compared to other spells, and it doesn't seem to work with what Rogue wants to do. It's just too expensive, too conditional, too situational, and the upside is really rather small compared to other things. So Wanted looks like an absolute failure. Okay, so one last card here. This is the Forest Guide, a new Druid minion, a 4 mana 1/6 that reads, at the end of your turn, both players draw a card. So quite quickly here, you can identify this card is not intended to be a threat on the board. It's got 1 attack. So this card is some kind of way to pull off a shenanigan or enact some sort of game plan, clearly. And if you look at the effect, there are really only 2 paths for this card to success. The first of which we've seen teased a little bit so far in Witchwood is perhaps in a hand druid, in which you're trying to get a lot of cards into your hand, and this becomes a card that draws you cards, and therefore you can turn into some wisps or maybe a mountain giant, whatever the hand druid plan is. We don't really know quite yet. Alternatively, this can also be a mill card, where you try to give your opponents too many cards and burn them out of cards and destroy their cards because their hand is too full. But unfortunately, in both of those cases, I still think Forest Guide looks a bit like a failure. Clearly, outside of those scenarios, a terrible card in every way. You don't want to give your opponent stuff. You don't want to play poorly statted minions for their cost. But even within those contexts, even where it's the only place this card could find success, it still looks like it's going to come up short to me. And there are a few reasons for that. First off, just adding 1 card to your hand in trade for playing a card isn't going to help Hand Druid much, particularly when turn 4 or 5, that range is probably where you're going to be looking to play a Mountain Giant anyway. I don't see how Forest Guide contributes to a Hand Druid style of play. Maybe if it lived for 5 turns, it would have some advantages, but it's not going to live for 5 turns. As a 1/6, your opponent will just take free trades into it, basically, with very little punishment, and you'll lose your asset, and you'll have given them 2 or 3 cards in the meantime, so some huge downsides there. And even in a mill scenario, where you get this out and you try to give your opponent a ton of cards, it feels like it's just going to be far too slow to accomplish that. Unlike things like Naturalize or Cold Light Oracle, which give your opponent multiple cards at once, and they do them very actively and have synergies with other things, this just isn't going to be able to do that at the same rate of speed. Like, your opponent is going to get the card first off, like you're both drawing at the end of your turn, so you don't get to use your card right away. They get to use theirs right away. They see your game plan. They get to make decisions based on your game plan and the card that's on board, or the forest guide that's on board. So you're basically giving them all of the power and all of the influence and all of the control while you're sitting there passively making an incredibly weak play. It's unlike Cold Light Oracle where you catch them off guard and blow stuff up. This one takes a long time to really do anything significant. So it's just so slow, so weak. Even off something like Oaken Summons where you can kind of get it for free. Not really for free, but you get 6 armor to go with it. I think that's still a big challenge for Forest Guide. There are some other cards, of course, that can recruit 4 drops out of your deck. So there might be some ways to cheat this thing out. I could give it a glimmer of hope. If Druid gets other mill cards, maybe, just maybe, this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back in a mill deck where it's like, you just need as much as possible to keep hammering them with additional cards. Maybe it could work there. Maybe in Wild in particular. I don't know. But in every other state, Arena, Standard Constructed, normal Hearthstone that's not totally shenanigan-based, I just don't see how Forest Guide works. This card looks like it's going to fall really far short of the mark to me. I think this one's pretty bad. And there you have it, folks. That's it for my detailed reviews of these 6 cards. Not the best set. I would say a couple really weak cards, a few that have only the slightest bit of potential, couple that are maybe promising, but nothing like outstanding. That said, we had some really good cards last time around, so that's bound to happen. But now what I'd like to do is go ahead and rate these cards from 1 to 5 stars in my quick reviews. Clockwork Automaton is a 3-star card. Blackwald Pixie is a 3-star card. Vex Kuro is a 3-star card. Scaleworm is a 2-star card. Wanted is a 1-star card. And Forest Guide is a 1-star card. And there you go, guys. Part 6 of my Witchwood review is done. I'm sure you have thoughts on these cards. I'm sure you're going to tell me why they're way better than I thought they were. Hey, guess what? I encourage you to do that. I like hearing what you have to say. I like hearing why you think I'm wrong. Helps me think about the game in new perspectives, learn stuff. Sometimes I still don't agree at the end of the day, but that's okay. I'm open to hearing. I like to know what the general sentiment of the community out there is. So leave your thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.